Please join me in welcoming our speaker, the founder and CEO of Espressive, Pat Calhoun.
All right. Oh, is there a clicker? Perfect. And of course, this is a talk about AI. So you can get started right now, I guess. And I already said it once. So thanks to all of you for attending. I hope this event works out well for you. Today, I'm actually going to be talking about large language models, ChatGPT, and so on. I'm actually fortunate enough to be the founder of a company called Espressive. We're kind of in the service desk automation space, so we've been in the AI space for quite some time now. And it's really interesting to see how ChatGPT has really transformed how our customers actually think about leveraging AI. I think that's number 3 now. And for those of you who haven't been keeping track, ChatGPT adoption hit 1 million users or 1 million subscribers in 5 days after it launched, after the 3.5 version launched back in November. So that's the fastest growing adoption for any technology that we're aware of. I'm kind of curious if anybody's actually confident or feels comfortable raising their hand if they haven't actually played around with ChatGPT. Anybody? 1, 2, 3? Okay, cool. There are a few people. It's a really interesting technology, and today we're going to talk about the fact that regardless of whether it introduces some opportunities or challenges, the reality is your employees are actually using it at work. And so we're going to talk about what you can do about that. And one of the things that I've actually come to recognize over my experience is that employees tend to gravitate towards things that actually help them at work. So I was actually a founder of a company that really focused on Wi-Fi way back when Wi-Fi was not a thing. We ended up getting acquired by Cisco. But back in those days, I'd be talking to a lot of organizations who would basically say that they had a no Wi-Fi policy, and half the time we found that they had Wi-Fi in the building even if they didn't know it. And what we came to realize is that employees, when they see something that actually helps them, they tend to gravitate towards it. And this is exactly the type of thing that we're seeing here with ChatGPT and other large language models. But Forbes ran a study last year really focused on automation and really looking at how is automation being leveraged by organizations. And when I look at automation, AI and automation are kind of similar in some sense in terms of how people are actually looking at the technology to help them be more efficient, more productive. And it was really interesting that what they found is that one of the key reasons why automation was a priority is organizations and leaders are having a hard time finding talent. And I think that problem has exacerbated itself through the pandemic. And certainly today, it's getting harder and harder to find really good talent. But it is interesting that when these types of studies were being done pre-pandemic, the driver for automation was cost savings. And you can see that has actually completely shifted to now people are looking at these types of technologies to really help them attract and retain talent because nobody really wants to deal with grunt work. And so they really want to automate as much of the grunt work as they can, and that actually helps with the overall employee experience. But 71% of their respondents also said that this is really around saving time and saving money. But these were sort of the key drivers for automation. And again, automation and AI are kind of in a very similar bucket. But at the same time, I can see that this chandelier is kind of in the way here. But what this is essentially saying is that while large language models are certainly providing a lot of value, there's a lot of concern around the threat that it actually poses to organizations. And so there's a number of organizations, particularly on Wall Street, that have basically banned or limited the use of large language models because they recognize that this is basically introducing an issue where some of their confidential data, perhaps some customer data, PII data, could be exposed to these large language models. And in fact, some of you may have actually heard about Samsung, where they had an issue where some of their engineers basically started submitting source code to ChatGPT, asking ChatGPT to help them troubleshoot the code. And what ended up happening is that source code is now part of ChatGPT's training corpus, or the data that it uses to train itself, which means that over time, that source code could end up finding its way into an answer to somebody's question, and it could be a competitor, it could be one of their partners, but that is a real threat, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of organizations are essentially kind of putting the brakes on ChatGPT and saying, hey, we don't want the use of ChatGPT, despite the fact that it actually has a lot of benefits. They also found that some of their employees had submitted some call transcripts asking ChatGPT to summarize the call. Again, whatever is in that call is now part of ChatGPT's training corpus. So whatever questions you're asking, whatever data you submit to some large language models, that data ends up being part of its training corpus. And so this is, again, the reason why a lot of organizations are basically putting a pause on its use. Now, but it goes beyond that, because some of this data that is confidential, while it's actually getting learned, it's not, by the way, it's not being learned by all of them. So when you're looking at your particular language model, you have to understand the licensing model and the way that they actually train their engine. So not every large language model operates this way, but a number of them actually do. And so the best way to really understand how your employees are using it and to protect yourself is to monitor the usage. But the problem is there is no way to monitor usage of large language models. People just go directly to, they can go directly to Bing, they can go directly to ChatGPT, and there really is no way to essentially understand what data is being submitted to these large language models. And so that's one of the big problems that exist in today's world. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can actually get more visibility into what people are actually submitting. Now, let me go back for a moment. There is another problem as well, which is really around hallucinations. Some of you may have heard of hallucinations. What we've actually found is that large language models don't like to admit that they don't know the answer. And in the absence of an answer, it starts making up answers. And this is one of the big problems that they have, and the industry term for that is called a hallucination, when a large language model just makes up an answer that is purely fictitious. Now, when we started the company, Espressive, we looked at all these different names that we wanted to use, and we used the name Espressive primarily because some of us at the beginning had I guess we can use the word passion for coffee, right? And so our product names are all based on caffeine and so on and so forth. And so I went to Bard, and I asked Bard, tell me about Espressive. So I don't know if you can see this in the back, but essentially what this is saying is that Espressive is a company that develops artificial intelligence-powered coffee machines. We do not. Now, I love coffee, but we don't make coffee machines. And so this is an example of hallucination. This is real, by the way. This actually came from Bard. I tried it again yesterday. It actually corrected itself, so that's good news. In addition to that, it also says that Google acquired us for somewhere around $500 million. Now, I think somebody would have sent me a memo if we got acquired, I would think, maybe my board, but I'm pretty sure that we haven't been acquired yet. But this is an example of a hallucination. And when you read it, if you actually don't know the answer, it looks believable. Anybody who would read this would actually believe it. This is the issue that a lot of people are having with large language models, is they just inherently trust whatever's coming back from it. Now, there was an attorney that was representing a client who was suing an airline because the client apparently got hurt in some way on the airplane. And the attorney was actually looking for precedents. He was looking for historical cases that were similar to his attorney. So it went to ChatGPT, couldn't find anything, so it went to ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT came out with a whole bunch of precedents or other cases similar to this particular case. Now, the attorney should have fact-checked it, but he did not, and so he just ended up submitting it to the courts, and it turns out that none of those historical cases even existed. So now that attorney's in a bunch of hot water, perhaps even to the point where he may end up losing his license. But the point is, if this happens with attorneys, it can happen with your employees as well. So one of the things that you guys need to, or gals, everybody here, need to actually think about is as your employees are asking questions, whatever comes back, if the answers are not correct, how can you monitor that? And how can you make sure that it's not creating harm to your organization? Now, that's not to just focus on the negatives, because there's a lot of positives, and we'll talk about the positives in a few moments, but that is a big problem that does exist out there. Because the reality is, you don't really have a choice. People will be using ChatGPT. There was a study that was done by Employee Benefits Network, and what they found is that in their studies, 43% of employees are actually using ChatGPT at work. 43%. 68% of them have not told their managers that they're using it. So perhaps they're doing it because they find that it's personally, it's helping their productivity, whatever the reason happens to be. This is the issue, is that when people are using it and you don't know, you don't really understand what the outcome could be. But 100% of employees could be using it safely if you actually take the right steps. And we're going to cover some of that today. Now, one of the ways that one of our customers, Automation Anywhere, has decided to do is they really wanted to be able to embrace large language models. They understand the value that it delivers to their employees, but again, they were worried about people submitting source code or customer data or what have you. And so what they ended up doing is essentially blocking access to large language model directly, whether it be Bard or it be Azure or what have you. They basically blocked it, and employees can access it through their virtual agent. What is a virtual agent? A virtual agent is where people go when they have a question. It could be an IT question, an HR question. It could be virtually any enterprise question. This is how they end up providing support. And what that gives them is visibility. And we'll talk a little bit more about the benefits of this, but this is one way that you could actually do this. Otherwise, people will just go directly. Because the reality is, you have no choice. Slack did another survey that was actually done just a few months ago, and what they found is that 90% of employees who use AI report that they're more productive. So it makes sense. This is why people are doing it. People will do it whether you want to or not. The question is, can you actually control it? Can you make sure that they're doing it in a way that's actually safe to the organization? Now, before I talk more about how to use this safely, I want to talk about another use case that we're actually seeing in the industry. And I'd love to see if there's a show of hands on this, but we're seeing a lot of organizations that are thinking, if LLMs are so smart, can I import my knowledge into an LLM and basically leverage a large language model to do enterprise search? Anybody looking at this? Lots of hands. Perfect. So let's talk about some of the challenges that actually introduces. So if you think about Azure or Bard or even ChatGPT, even OpenAI's version, these large language models were trained on trillions and trillions of different types of data. The amount of content that most organizations have is like a drop in an ocean. Maybe you have 1,000 knowledge articles. Maybe you have 10,000 knowledge articles. It's nothing but a drop in the ocean. If you think about the challenges that I talked about earlier around hallucinations and so on, the problem that it presents is that when somebody asks a question, you don't really know what's going to come back. Is it going to provide your knowledge? Is it going to provide an answer that it was trained on? Let's say that an employee were to ask a question around 401ks. Now, these large language models were trained on thousands and thousands of different sites that talk about 401ks. It could be Fidelity, it could be a bunch of other providers, et cetera. How do these large language models focus on your content versus everything else that it has? There's no way for you to actually predict that. You don't know. So if somebody asks a question around 401ks, they may get your content, they may end up getting some other thing that it was trained on, particularly if the question that's being asked is not specific or it's not really being answered very clearly in your content. So you don't really know what's going to happen. And so what we are seeing is a different approach. And I'll talk about the way that we're doing it, but there's different ways to do this, right? And it's not, and the point here is to only leverage large language models in the way that they actually do deliver value, which is around generating a response. But doing search is not what a large language model is all about. So the way that we've been looking at this is first you have all this content, this knowledge. The first thing that you need to do is make sure that you enrich the content. What does that mean? People may use the word 401k, they may say retirement plan, they may say, there's a bunch of different words that they may use. They may not call it a rollover, they may call it something else. And so now you have to start thinking about, how do I start adding tags or enhance the content that I have to make sure that it's actually, that there's a match. And that in itself is actually not a trivial task, but it's something that you need to do if you want to maximize the value and the usage of your knowledge. The second thing that we've actually seen is that vector databases are actually much better at doing search than large language models. So the way that we're doing is we import all the content into a vector database, and that enables us to take a question and then find the answer inside the vector database. But the problem with vector databases is that it's going to come up with a whole bunch of things that are relevant and not really relevant. So we're going to get a whole bunch of hits. Now, one of the big problems with large language models is that it doesn't really understand enterprise security. And so some of this content may or may not be accessible to this particular employee, but the large language model doesn't know that. So anything that's imported into the large language model is fair game. Everybody will see it. And so what really you need to do at this point is to take a look at the particular content, look at this individual, and then determine whether this individual should or should not have access to this content. And that generally is done through external access control rules, so there's ways to do that. And it depends if the knowledge is sitting in like a ServiceNow or a SharePoint or a Confluence. There's different ways to go and validate that. But the other thing that we've also seen is that then you will end up with a bunch of content that came back from the vector database, some of which answers the question or is close to answering the question, and some of it is not. But it's sort of tangential and sort of related. And so now you have to go through and look at all the different hits that come back and figure out which one is most relevant to the question. And then, this is where you want to use large language models. Then you take the content and you ask a large language model to go rewrite the content in a way that can be consumed by a mere mortal. And the reason why I say this is that sometimes content could be written by technical people, and it was intended to be read by technical people. It could be written by a lawyer, and it's intended to be read by a lawyer. And so you want to be able to take this content and ask the large language model to simply rewrite the content as it is, but just simplify it, make it easy to consume. Sometimes we also see that answers could be coming in through multiple different documents or multiple places in documents. So you end up with all these different fragments. Large language models are really, really good about taking all that and creating one paragraph or one answer out of all of that. That's really where I see large language models helping solve this particular enterprise search problem. But just wanted to cover this because I'm seeing a big move towards looking at whether large language models can actually solve this particular problem. So here's an example. This is using our particular tool, but here's an example where one of our employees asked a question around how many days off what is the legal definition or legal requirement for parental leave? And you'll see that the question is actually fairly vague, but what you see here is that the virtual agent comes back and says, well, I found content that's relevant to this particular organization, so here's our policy, because that's probably more important than whatever the legal requirement is. Here's the policy. In addition to that, because you're asked about the legal requirement, here's the legal requirement for employees in California. But you'll see that the employee is not asking, I'm a California-based employee, I'm full-time, here's a bunch of context about me and what is the requirement. So what we do is we take a look at the employee's context, and then we create a prompt that really makes sure that we're asking the right question. This is where prompt engineering comes in. I'm sure a bunch of you have actually heard about prompt engineering. Prompt engineering is just a way to pose the question to a large language model in the most efficient way to make sure that you're getting the answer that you want. And this is really what we've been focusing a lot of our time on, is when we're interacting with these large language models to make sure that we're supplementing the question being asked with relevant data around that employee or devices they use or what have you. But there are other limitations as well to large language models. And what we've actually learned over the past 7 years as we've been running this company is that employees, when they ask a question, they don't want homework. They don't want to go do work. They just want something to be taken care of on their behalf. That's why they call the service desk. They want people to do something for them. And this is where automation comes in. And where large language models do not really have a play today is invoking an automation on behalf of an employee. So if I said something like, how many days of vacation do I have, to a Bard or an OpenAI, it would actually not know the answer. It wouldn't know how to reach into your Workday or into your Infor system or what have you, success factors, to go and get you the answer. But that's what these virtual agents actually do. They can go and reset a password, or they can go and deploy, they can provision an application, they can get PTO data, what have you. And this is where there's a lot of limitations with large language models. They simply do not have a way to reach into your corporate data, into your corporate systems. They're really designed primarily to generate a response. That's what they're really good at doing. And they certainly do not understand the domain of the employee. You can go to ChatGPT today and you can ask it, how do I reset my password? It will come up with an answer. But it's not the right answer for your organization, but it will come up with an answer. I can guarantee that. The employee tries it, they'll get a little frustrated because it probably won't work for them, but it's good at generating an answer. So how can you provide this in a way that's safe and responsible? Now, as I mentioned earlier, what we are seeing is organizations are integrating it with their virtual agent. I'm sure there's other ways of doing it. I'm just familiar with this particular approach because this is the way that we've been doing it. But what this enables us to do is to do some validation before we send things to the large language model. So if somebody were to send source code as an example and say, help me debug this code, you'll see that the virtual agent comes back and says, sorry, our policy says you can't do that. Now, it is possible that your organization have their own private large language model. And maybe this is where you want to be able to direct source code questions, debugging questions to your own private large language model versus going to OpenAI. OpenAI has a lot of value, it has a lot of content, but maybe for these types of questions, it's more appropriate to go to a specific large language model. Or there's also some large language models that actually have very specific training around, they have training around a very specific vertical. Perhaps it's pharma, or maybe it's healthcare. And so you want to make sure that you're directing the questions to the appropriate large language model, and this is where employees simply would not, they wouldn't really understand that for this type of question I need to go here, this type of question I need to go there. But this is where these types of tools can actually make those decisions in real time. But it's also about being able to disable access to content. So if somebody were to ask a question around healthcare as an example, or around Epic, it could very well be that the organization does not want to go to a large language model. They just prefer to use their own content. And so that's also something that these tools can actually do. As we talked about earlier, making sure that you prioritize your content over just things that OpenAI can just generate on its own, as well as restricting questions that are work-related. Now, why is that important? The way that a lot of these large language models are monetized is through the use of tokens. Does anybody know how many tokens my speech has actually has used in the past, what is it now, 20 minutes? Anybody know? I don't know. I have no idea. And so this is really hard. When people are asking questions, those questions and the answers that are coming back are using up tokens. If somebody were to go to your OpenAI, your version, maybe your Azure version of OpenAI, and ask for OpenAI to write a book, let's write a poem, or let's write a biography, you're paying for that. And you actually have no way to know that people are asking those questions, but those are dollars that are just going out the front door. And so being able to understand and restrict what types of questions are being used is also something that has a lot of value to make sure that you're not unnecessarily paying for things that are just not relevant to the organization. And lastly, it's really about minimizing hallucinations. Now, we can't eliminate hallucinations altogether, but what we've actually found is that if you ask the question properly, if you ask it correctly, it can minimize hallucinations. There are ways of asking ChatGPT, you could try it, and say, only give me the answer if you're confident that you know the answer, right? And then it will back off on hallucinations. So there's different ways of asking things. Again, most employees don't know, and they're just going to ask the question the way they normally interact. But there are ways, and so we've actually been doing a lot of testing. We found that hallucinations really are minimized quite a bit as a result. But it goes beyond that. Now, people typically go to virtual agents for things like I need access to software, or perhaps they're locked out, or they're trying to figure out how to set up an out of office in Outlook or what have you. Maybe they have an issue with a paycheck. This is typically what they go to a virtual agent for. But what we've actually seen now that we've done these integrations is people are really expanding the use of a virtual agent to really focus more on employee productivity type tools. So things like getting a summary of a Zoom meeting. Now, it is possible for somebody to actually do this without a virtual agent. You don't need a virtual agent to get a summary of a meeting. However, to do this, you have to connect into Zoom, you have to download the transcript. An average 1-hour meeting has 9,000 words, and you cannot submit 9,000 words to ChatGPT or any other LLM. So you basically have to break it up in small pieces, and you have to figure out a way to interact with these large language models to say, here's a part of the meeting, and please remember this context. I'm about to send you another part of the meeting. And so it starts building its knowledge based on that meeting on all these different chunks, if you will, of the meeting that you're uploading. And then after that, it can generate a summary, but it really depends on how you ask the question. And so asking the question correctly, again, goes back to prompt engineering, is really key here. And most people just say, I need a summary of the meeting. They don't really ask the question correctly, because what they're looking for is a very specific thing around the meeting. And so knowing how to ask the question is very, very important. And then finally, it's the fact that if they just did this on ChatGPT, you're kind of back to where Samsung was, where people are submitting things that may be proprietary or confidential in that meeting to ChatGPT, and now ends up being part of its training corpus. So there's a bunch of reasons why it makes a lot of sense to start looking at these types of tools to enhance the overall use of large language models. Because it knows, these tools would know, this is an internal meeting or there's proprietary data, so let's not go to a public large language model, let's leverage a private large language model for these types of requests. But we're seeing things like people asking around, how can I make meetings more effective? And they're really, if you haven't tried it, you should give it a shot. I mean, it's pretty impressive what it comes up with. There's a lot of really good content in some of these large language models. So shifting a little bit to virtual agents and how virtual agents actually deliver value. Now, we've been integrating, as I said, with large language models, but that's not primarily what these virtual agents do. These virtual agents are really more around automating your service desk. It could be your IT service desk, it could be your HR service desk, it could be your payroll service desk, it could be any form of service desk. Because I started my career in the service desk, so admittedly some time ago, although things have not changed all that much in the number of years since then. People are still calling about password resets. And it's interesting to see that here we are in 2023, and for most organizations, the way that they're basically scaling their service desk is by putting butts in seats. And we have technology today like automation, we have technology like AI, there's another use of the word AI, that basically help these organizations scale their service desk. So this is a good opportunity to start thinking differently about how do you build your support infrastructure by leveraging some of these tools. But we also see a lot of organizations, particularly now that we've gone hybrid. We were talking about this earlier. I was talking to somebody from the Mutual of Omaha. And basically what he was saying was that, pre-pandemic, everybody was in Omaha. Now people have kind of scattered across the four winds. And I'm seeing that even in my organization as well. I have people now that are global. And so what this really means is you have to start thinking differently about how you support these employees, because they're going to be working their own convenient 9 to 5, not your convenient 9 to 5. And so how do you support them? The other thing we also found is that as people started working from home, is that they end up working non-traditional hours. Perhaps, now that I'm home, I'm going to take my kid to school. Maybe I need to handle some kind of a school-related event in the afternoon or what have you. I'll make up for it in the evening, so I'm going to work in the evening. And if I have an IT issue or an HR issue at 8 o'clock at night, I still need to get the support that I need. And so this is where these virtual agents come in, is making sure that people are getting the support that they need 24 hours a day. But what we've also been seeing is this is now an opportunity to get proactive. Imagine a world where a virtual agent reaches out to you and lets you know that there's an issue with your battery. Oh, and by the way, your laptop is under warranty, and we can order one for you. So do you want a replacement for your laptop? And if you say yes, you'll get all the tracking information. And when you get the laptop, the virtual agent will reach out to you and let you know how to move your data from your old laptop to your new laptop. So this is now a world where we can actually eliminate the need for people to even call the service desk altogether. This is really more of a proactive support. And this is where you start really elevating the overall employee experience, where people are no longer thinking about tickets. They're just thinking about getting their jobs done, which, of course, improves the overall NPS score. We had a customer of ours that's in the insurance space who ended up deploying our platform, and they did an NPS survey after going live, and they got a 95-point NPS score, which is phenomenal. If you've ever been in the support space, in the service desk space, you don't normally get 95, so that was great. So my last slide, and then I'll open it up to questions. I just want to talk about one of our customers, which is Dexcom. So pre-pandemic, they came to us. This customer, they build glucose monitoring devices. So if anybody here has diabetes, you'll be familiar with Dexcom. Basically, it's a patch that goes on your arm, and it lets you know if there's an issue. So this is like a proactive way to monitor your sugar levels. And essentially, this company, because of the fact that diabetes is, has become a global pandemic, I shouldn't be using the word pandemic, a global issue, they've been growing 30% quarter over quarter for the past 4 years. When we started engaging with them, they were hiring, on average, about 500 people a quarter. Fast forward to today, they're hiring 500 people a month. And so they're onboarding more people than they ever had. And all of these people are being onboarded, and it's been crushing the service desk. Again, I started my career on the service desk. If you've ever been on the service desk, it's like being on the front line. You're constantly being bombarded with issues. And it could be very, very stressful. And this is exactly what this team was going through. And the CIO made a decision that he was not going to add more capacity to the IT team. The company had to grow, and the team had to figure out how to leverage automation and AI to help grow the organization so that they could focus their spend on things that actually were revenue generating versus just support infrastructure. Through this, they went global. They ended up building teams in Mexico, in the Philippines, in Europe. And so they ended up having to shift to 24-hour, 7 days a week support to handle manufacturing that was being done across the globe. And they did all of that without having to hire a single person. And this is where the opportunity, really comes in of rethinking how your employees actually get support. So this is all I was going to cover for today. I would love to answer any questions that you may have around virtual agents, large language models, ChatGPT, or virtually anything else. Any questions? Yes? Yep. Is that a private LLM that you're sending it to? Well, if you're doing it, then it goes to wherever you want to go, right? The way that we do this today is we actually have our own large language model. And so we use our own large language model for response generation and summarization of content. If somebody is asking a question, let's say, how do I add funds to a purchase order in Infor ERP, let's just say. We don't have the answer to that. But that we can actually get that through a large language model. So we basically direct the questions to a large language model, to the appropriate large language model, based on the question that's being asked. Does that answer the question?
I think so. I just want to make sure when, let's say it's some technical data, like, okay, you use this formula or whatever. If you're trying to get a summary of that to make it readable and you're doing some prompt engineering,
Yep.
you can decide, okay, I'm going to have it summarized with your private LLM.
Yes.
First. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, we make decisions in real time of where to direct questions based on the question that's being asked, the task that needs to be done. Translation is another good example. If we need to translate something to a different language, we'll just use our own private LLM. We won't go to ChatGPT because we don't really, that content doesn't need to go to ChatGPT. Yeah.
If we're looking at your own private LLM, how do you manage drift on the private LLM, and how do you segment data for the various customers?
So we've been doing this for the past 7 years. So every customer has their own private instance, essentially, and the learning only happens within that instance. So there's no sharing of data, because that's a very, very valid point. Now, the training of the model itself is based on questions that are being asked, so that will always be true, and that's the only way that AI learns, is it learns by questions that are being asked, but it's learning within the context of that environment. Yeah. Yes, another question up here. Yes.
Thanks. My question is around the virtual agents. Do you, from your experience, view companies pursuing a single virtual agent that is trained on a growing corpus of information versus dividing it into multiple virtual agents, each of which maybe is trained in a very specific domain and it's very, very specialized?
Yep. So what we've actually found over the past few years, and again, I used to run products as service now, so I'm familiar with the concept of every domain has its own virtual agent, just like every domain has its own portal or its own knowledge environment. The reality is employees don't really understand the roles and responsibilities of different departments, right? If I have a Workday question, is that an IT question? Is it an HR question? And the answer is it depends on the nature of the question. So expecting them to go to one particular place and ask it is going to be very cumbersome, and it's going to impact your adoption overall. I recall, this is some years ago, but we were working with a customer. This was an HR environment, but the number one question going into HR, the number one ticket, if you will, going into HR, were people calling in because they had a problem with, or emailing in because they had a problem with their paycheck. But it turns out for this particular company, payroll was actually a finance function, it was not an HR function. Employees don't know that. They just send an email to HR, open a ticket. Within the mandatory 48-hour SLA, they get a response back from HR that says, sorry, this is a finance question. Please open a ticket over there. Meanwhile, everybody in HR are basically high-fiving themselves because they're all meeting their SLAs, right? And so this is sort of the environment that employees deal with all the time. So this concept of having a combined virtual agent where a single virtual agent where people can ask virtually anything, behind the scenes, if we can't automate it, then we're using machine learning to go figure out where to send the question. Is it a facilities question? Is it an HR question, a finance question, what have you? That improves the overall experience, but it's also going to help with your overall adoption. Yeah.
So I have sorry.
Yes.
Cool. So I'm over here. So November 2022, right? Like that's when ChatGPT kind of created their name. The adoption of large language models all of a sudden skyrocketed. And I'm assuming that because you guys have been doing this for like 7 years, that you have experience in that field. You're doing what you're doing, but then today, right? Like comparing it from like November 2022 to where we are today, I think that there are especially in the knowledge management space, if you're talking about enterprise infrastructures, et cetera, ChatGPT wasn't necessarily built for enterprises then, but then now, as we're kind of coming to today, you have companies like KMS Lighthouse, MoveWorks, Icera, you have Microsoft partnering with OpenAI, where they have your private tenant. You also have Google, with their unlimited amounts of money being thrown into generative AI right now through Vertex AI. So the question that I have is, what are you doing to remain competitive and keep your competitive advantage over companies that have almost unlimited money? Versus you guys.
Yep. Okay, that's a fair question. And we do compete with MoveWorks, we compete with Icera. I would say the reason why our deflection rate, so let me define a deflection. A deflection is something that is resolved with no human intervention. Okay, that's what we call a deflection. The reason why our customers typically see north of 55% deflection is because of our focus on automation. That's not the case with MoveWorks. Their background is coming from Google, they come from Facebook, and so they naturally looked at the problem more around search than around automation. I know that they're now delving into automation, but it's fairly new for them. And so that's the reason why we've actually been very successful. So we have organizations like DXC or Tech Mahindra that are basically in Atos and Kyndryl and others that basically are service providers. They're delivering a digital workplace offering, and they use our tool to make sure that they can reduce their headcount in their service desk and provide a better experience. So it's really the focus on the automation component. Search is still important, and there is content out there. And of course, we want to be able to leverage content as much as we can. But it goes back to my earlier point that people don't like reading. They just want things to get taken care of. The other problem with content is that a lot of employees are not technical enough to even know how to ask the question. And so if you've worked on a service desk, you'll know that it's very common for people to call up or send an email and say, my laptop's broken. Well, what does that mean? It means nothing. They don't understand how to say, my X509 certificate expired on my Cisco AnyConnect, so I can't set up a VPN connection. Like, they don't know how to say that. They're just like, my VPN's not working. And so there's really no knowledge that's going to help you when people don't know how to ask the question correctly. And so what we've also found is that a conversational platform that engages the employee the way that an agent would, to ask questions, clarifying questions to get to the root of the issue, and only then provide an answer, is the only way that you're going to maximize deflection. So we focus a lot on that as well. So if we can't automate, or if the question is sufficiently vague, then we want to make sure that we're engaging the employee to try to extract as much data as we can to make sure that we're solving the problem. That is how we compete against the Iceras, the MoveWorks. Microsoft doesn't really play in our space too much, although they do have, of course, they have their own version of OpenAI. But their focus is really different. They're really focusing more on enterprise search versus service desk automation. And even they recently announced a focus on a vector database to really compete with some of the vector DB people out there, because they also recognize that LLMs by themselves is not the answer to search. Yeah. Yep. Another question up here.
Thank you. Great presentation. So for the example you were giving on the screen in which someone was trying to understand the source code.
Yep.
Going back to what you were saying, if someone keeps it vague, he or she does not say, hey, help me debug a source code. They just say, help me fix this. How are you making sure the boundaries are set up in your system, on your LLM models, that system is smart to understand, hey, this is actually a source code which a user is asking, or any other query which you want to block? Like, how are you making sure the boundaries are set in your models?
Yeah, so we've gone through a lot of training to do that. 7 years worth of training at looking at interactions and being able to parse the interaction to understand the question being asked. But that's essentially it. We have to understand if somebody's submitting source code versus just asking a question. That's essentially what we do all the time. So, and we're also leveraging our own large language model sometimes to even summarize the question. We've seen people write paragraphs, like books, as opposed to, I can't log into my laptop, they'll write a whole paragraph. And so we even have to summarize some of those to be able to understand the question that's being asked. So we use our own large language model to really detect the question that's being asked before we send it to a public large language model. Yeah.
Thank you, Pat. Sorry, great presentation. I would assume that there's a silent consent that there's no LLM can operate or function by itself. I think humans still has to intervene somewhat when you're building the model or when you're deploying. We all know that OpenAI hired thousands of contractors in Kenya doing their reading.
Exactly.
So just curious, what's your model when you're building this LLM with your clients? How do you leverage the human component in the building and also the deployment?
Yeah. So the way that it works with our particular tool is when somebody asks us a question that has confused us, and it happens. Somebody asked us, I think it was quite some years ago, they asked us about the speed velocity of an unladen swallow. So if anybody here is a Monty Python fan, you'll know where that comes from. But people do ask those questions. Sometimes they're legitimate questions. That one was not. But what we do is when these questions come in that we don't necessarily recognize, I have a team, I have an army, if you will, of computational linguists and data scientists, engineers, and they basically get a fully anonymized, scrubbed of all PII data version of that initial interaction, and then we use that for training purposes to train our engine. But we strip out source code, we strip out all that stuff. So there's nothing that would be considered confidential in that interaction. But that is the way that we've been training our engine over the past 7 years, because you are correct. AI requires humans. You have to train the engine, whether you're hiring them in Kenya or in Mexico or in India or in the United States. There is no engine today that learns on its own. So that's how we've been doing it. Today, we understand well over 4 billion different things across the enterprise, which is why we support 15 different enterprise departments, whether it be facilities or payroll or SAP questions, you name it. But all of that is because of all the usage that's been going on. So every day, we're getting smarter and smarter. Did that answer the question? Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. The only way that we can scale is by having that fully automated. So all of the guardrails, everything is fully automated. So there's no human in the loop, if you will, to make sure that the guardrails are being implemented, because we would never scale as a company if that was the case. Yeah. And every once in a while something may fall through and oh, we didn't think of this particular use case, and then we have to go and supplement the automation. But that doesn't happen that much anymore. Yeah. Yes.
So with all the bad data, and that's not a good term.
Yes,
right?
with all the bad data.
Inaccurate data.
Yep.
How about that? Of all the inaccurate data that's created, how do you really get to the truth, and how do you filter out the bad data so that it doesn't keep learning on falsehoods?
Okay, so how do we make sure that we're not learning based on bad data, which is in itself not an easy task? The way that we do this is really through the experience. When somebody asks us a question, we will provide the answer. If somebody says, well, that wasn't helpful, and the way that they say that, because if anybody here has ever written reviews on Yelp, you'll know that typically you're very motivated to write a review when you have a really bad experience. When you have an okay experience, you don't write reviews, right? And so the way that we built our platform is that the question that's being asked is, I need somebody to help me. And so when somebody hits that button, says, I need somebody to help me, which is code word for create a ticket, that in itself creates a loop in our system that essentially informs somebody that there's a problem with that particular content. Because it's really, really hard otherwise, right? And if anybody here has ever gone through your own knowledge, you probably will find that you've got company holidays from 2015 are still sitting in a SharePoint, right? And so there's just a lot of garbage out there. Yeah. Yes, question out there.
What's stopping multiple models or multiple large language models from looping into each other? For instance, right, if I've got a lake and I'm working within my data lake and I've got my model, what stops somebody who's enterprising and wants to take your knowledge and tie their system into yours? Because it can ask questions a lot faster and learn a lot quicker from another model. What's stopping that from helping itself?
There's nothing that's stopping it. We have customers that basically engage us through a series of APIs, and they're doing exactly what you're saying.
Right, because that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I could go to Snowflake and go to
Yep.
lakes and models that exist, build out mine from that root knowledge, and then build out off of my knowledge on top. So that is a strategy that's being used.
That is possible, but I think it goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is that if the questions that you are asking are, if you're submitting data to your large language model and you say, here's customer data from 2022, please identify the following patterns. It's pretty good about doing that. If you upload a bunch of knowledge articles and you say, what is our 401k policy, that's where you get into problems, because now you're asking a pretty, a generic question that it's been trained on a lot of content. So it really depends on the use case that you're trying to go after. But if you're saying, here's content, please help me identify patterns in content, which is how we do it. We're finding content from knowledge, and then we submit it to a large language model, and we say, please summarize these paragraphs. That's where LLMs really come in and really shine. Yeah. Yes?
Is that me? Pat, correct? Pat?
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Question for you. You didn't get into the vector databases, so I drew some ideas of what that meant.
Yes.
So my question for you is, I like the concept of a virtual assistant sitting between maybe an external large language model and your employee, and then you scrub that to make sure there's no PII and so on and so forth. And then maybe you reference, I'm assuming, a vector database or some sort of database. As you scale within an organization, do you envision a client of yours might have multiple databases built up for the individual use cases, and then you'd put like a conversation manager to figure out which database to reference to bring that information back to the employee? How do you, what's your vision of scaling this up at an enterprise level so your solution covers all, not just a service desk, but covers all type of virtual assistant conversations?
Yeah, we're doing that with a common database. We're not splitting up departments with different databases, because it comes back to the fact that when somebody asks a question, it could be an IT question, it could be an HR question, and sometimes it's really hard to distinguish one from the other. I can't access Workday versus I can't access my beneficiaries in Workday, right? And so if those have to go to different places, then there's a lot of, as you said, there's a lot of traffic cop kind of effort that has to go on. And so our philosophy has been put everything in a common vector database and then do the search from there. And we found that that has actually worked. We have customers using us in 15 different enterprise departments today, and we've been very effective at finding content.
And I don't mean to steal the microphone. Could you educate me? What, I made an assumption what a vector database was.
Yeah, I'm happy to do, actually, if you don't mind, maybe we could
Deal.
chat a little bit later about.
Yes,
yeah,
sir, thank you.
And actually, we have Nelson here as well, who's very technical. Any other questions? Cool. All right. Well, thanks, everyone, and hopefully this was useful, and I'll be around as well.